Hello, my name is Dr. Matute, University of Arkansas, PTC. This is a summary of the respiratory system. We'll start by introducing the main functions of the respiratory system. There are two primary functions of the respiratory system: to inhale oxygen. This oxygen that is inhaled, it is used for energy production. The second primary function is to exhale carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is exhaled because it is a toxic waste that needs to be removed from the body. Secondary functions of the respiratory system include olfactory sense, speech production, acid-base balance, water homeostasis, and heat balance. Let's look at the main anatomical divisions of the respiratory system. We have the airways, the nose, the pharynx, the larynx, and the trachea. Again, the airways, the nose, the pharynx, the larynx, and the trachea. They are airways because they bring in oxygen and is the return route for CO2. So oxygen in, CO2 out. The second anatomical division will be the lungs. The lungs are the primary organs of respiration. That is where gaseous exchange actually takes place. The third main division of the respiratory system is the respiratory muscles. And there are three main categories of respiratory muscles: the diaphragm, the rib cage muscles, and the abdominal muscles. So for the respiratory muscles, we have the diaphragm, the rib cage muscles, and the abdominal muscles. These muscles, they are important for the breathing mechanics. That is, they contract and they relax the thoracic cavity. And when these muscles contract or relax, they change the air volume and the air pressure in the bony thorax or the thoracic cavity. When these muscles relax and or contract, they change the volume and the pressure in the bony thorax. Division number 4 will be the bony thorax or the thoracic cavity. It controls the volume-pressure relationship of gases. It controls the volume-pressure relationship of gases. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. And this volume-pressure relationship is very important for the external respiration mechanics. The nose. Oxygen is drawn in via the nostrils or the external nares, as they may be called. The human nose is divided into two by the septum or the vomer bone. Carbon dioxide is expelled via the nose, just as oxygen enters via the nose. The nose is equipped specially for this function of oxygen intake. The nose has hairs and mucus. The hair and the mucus is used to trap pathogens and debris. So in other words, the hair and the mucus, they act as filters. The nose also has olfactory epithelia, which enables us to be able to smell. The pharynx. It channels the air from the nose to the larynx. So the pharynx, it channels the air from the nose to the larynx. The larynx, it has two main functions. It contains the vocal cords that are used for sound production. It also channels the air to the trachea. It also channels the oxygen that is breathed in to the trachea. The trachea or the windpipe, it is a passageway of air to and from the lungs. The lungs. The lungs are the primary organs of gaseous exchange. Otherwise, gaseous exchange takes place in the lungs. The trachea divides into two main subdivisions that are called the bronchi, to have the left bronchi and the right bronchi. So the trachea divides into the left bronchi or the left bronchus and the right bronchus, the two bronchi. Now, each of the bronchus ends up forming one of the lungs. So we have the right lung and the left lung as a consequence of the division of the trachea. The right lung has three lobes. It's subdivided into three lobes: the superior, the middle, and the inferior lobes. The left lung is subdivided into two lobes: the superior lobe and the inferior lobe. Now, given that the lungs are the main organs of respiration, how are they adapted to their functions? Number one, they are made up of elastic tissues. Number two, they are composed of spongy tissues. Number three, they are made up of blood vessels. Number four, they are composed of nerves, or they are connected with nerves for nervous control. And number five, the lungs, they present a large surface area. They present a large surface area. Now let's quickly look at the subdivisions of the internal airways. So what we call the internal airways, they are the airways that are found inside the lungs. The external airways, they end with the trachea. The internal airways, they will begin from the bronchi right down to the alveoli. So the three main subdivisions of the internal airways are, the very first one are the bronchi. We have the primary bronchi, the secondary bronchi, and the tertiary bronchi. The second subdivision of the internal airways are the bronchioles. The bronchioles. We have the primary bronchioles and the terminal and respiratory bronchioles. So we have the primary bronchioles, which will subdivide to the terminal bronchioles, and then the terminal bronchioles will subdivide into the respiratory bronchioles. The third subdivision of the internal airways are the alveoli ducts and the alveoli sacs. Alveoli ducts and the alveoli sacs. So the respiratory bronchioles, they will subdivide to form the alveoli ducts, and then the alveoli ducts, they will end up with the alveoli sacs. The alveoli sacs are the actual site for gaseous exchange. The alveoli sacs are the actual sites for gaseous exchange. Now, lungs are located in the thoracic cavity, and inside the thoracic cavity, the lungs are specifically contained in the pleural cavities. Pleural cavities. The muscles of respiration. There are three main groups of muscles of respiration. Number one, the diaphragm. Number two, the rib cage muscles. And number three, the abdominal muscles. Again, there are three main groups of muscles of respiration: the diaphragm, the rib cage muscles, and the abdominal muscles. Now, the diaphragm, which is located below the lungs and the heart, um, when it contracts, it increases the thoracic volume. When it contracts, it increases the thoracic volume. And when it contracts, it depresses. It moves on to an inferior position, so it depresses. When the diaphragm relaxes, it elevates, it moves to a superior position. And when that happens, it decreases the thoracic volume. So the diaphragm is capable of depressing and elevating, depressing and elevating. And when that happens, the volume in the thoracic cage and the pressure in the thoracic cage, they change. The rib cage muscles. We have the intercostal muscles, the external intercostal muscles. Then we have the pectoralis minor and the serratus anterior. These intercostal muscles, which are both internal and external, so the intercostal muscles are both external and internal, they are found between the ribs. They are found between the ribs, and they form they form the walls of the chest wall. Now, they are responsible, or they are involved with the mechanical aspects of breathing. They can expand or shrink the chest cavity. They can expand or shrink the chest cavity. When this happens, they increase or decrease the volume of the chest cavity. And when this happens also, they change the pressure of gases in the chest cavity. Muscle group number 3, the abdominal muscles. The abdominal muscles, they are also called the accessory expiratory muscles. Accessory expiratory muscles. In other words, they are involved with the expiration or with the exhalation of gases. In this case, specifically carbon dioxide. And these muscles, they include the rectus abdominis, the external oblique, the internal oblique, and the transversus abdominis. Rectus abdominis, external oblique, internal oblique, and the transversus abdominis. When they contract, they decrease the volume of the thoracic cavity. When they decrease the volume of the thoracic cavity, they are increasing the pressure of carbon dioxide in the thoracic cavity. So carbon dioxide is exhaled. The bony thorax, or the thoracic cavity, it protects organs of respiration, which are the lungs. It contributes to the mechanisms or the mechanics of breathing. It serves as an attachment site for the respiratory muscles of the ribs. Now, in terms of its breathing mechanics, it can expand or it can relax. Now, whether it expands or it relaxes, it affects the respiratory, it affects the volume and the pressure. It affects the volume and the pressure. Now, it can increase, so the bony thorax can increase or decrease respiratory volume. The bony thorax can increase or decrease respiratory pressure. These two changes, the changes in volume and changes in pressure, they are very essential for respiration. Now let's look at volume pressure relationships. Volume pressure relationships. The respiratory muscles contract. When they contract, the thoracic volume increases. When the thoracic volume increases, the partial pressure of oxygen decreases, and when the partial pressure of oxygen decreases in our thoracic cavity, oxygen moves in. When the partial pressure of oxygen in our thoracic cavity decreases, oxygen moves in, so we are able to inhale oxygen. So that's what happens when the respiratory muscles contract. Now, when the respiratory muscles, when they relax, when muscles contract, they must relax. When they relax, what happens? The thoracic volume will decrease. When the thoracic volume decreases, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the thoracic cavity will increase. Now, once as the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the thoracic cavity increases, then carbon dioxide will be exhaled. It will be sent out of our bodies. So how can we explain the volume pressure relationship in our thoracic cavity? This relationship, the volume pressure relationship, is described as being an inverse relationship. Inverse relationship. Mathematically, an inverse relationship is written as 1 over x. That means that as one of the factors or one of the parameter increases, the other parameter decreases. So what does that mean? In a thoracic cavity, if the volume increases, if the volume of our thoracic cavity increases, the pressure in our thoracic cavity will decrease. On the other hand, if the pressure in our thoracic cavity increases, the volume of our thoracic cavity will decrease. Gases move or flow from a high partial pressure area to a low partial pressure area. Gases move or flow from a high partial pressure area to a low partial pressure area. What does that mean? When we inhale oxygen, it means that the partial pressure of oxygen in our external environment is greater than the partial pressure of oxygen in our internal environment. So oxygen moves from the external to the internal. On the other hand, when we exhale carbon dioxide, it means that the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in a thoracic cavity is greater than the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in our external environment. So CO2 leaves our internal environment to the external environment. The bell jar model. The bell jar model illustrates the thoracic cavity. They illustrate or represent the thoracic cavity. The glass wall of the jar represents the rib cage. The base rubber sheets represents the diaphragm, and the balloons we have in there, they represent the lungs. I'm assuming that you're looking at the study materials that are provided to you to be able to follow what I'm saying. Now, the upper portions of the tube, they represent the pharynx and the larynx. The lower portions of the tube represent the trachea. The subdivisions of the tube represent the left bronchioles and the right bronchioles. The subdivision of the tube represents the left bronchioles and the right bronchioles. And of course, Each of these bronchioles, that's the two bronchi, they end up forming the left lung and the right lung. Now let's discuss briefly the bell jar mechanism. Now, if the rubber sheet is depressed, if you do this in the lab, if the rubber sheet is depressed, the volume increases, the balloons inflate, and the pressure in the jar decreases. Oxygen rushes in. One more time. If the rubber sheet is depressed, the volume of the thoracic cavity that it represents will increase, the balloons will inflate, the pressure in the jar will decrease, and oxygen will rush in. That will represent inhalation. Now, if the rubber sheet at the base of this bell jar is elevated, pushed inwards, the volume decreases, the balloons deflate, the pressure increases, and gas is sent out of the bell jar. That gas that is sent out of the bell jar, it represents carbon dioxide that is being exhaled. Now, let's quickly look at the basis for gas exchange. Look at the basis for gas exchange. Number one, volume pressure relationship. We've touched on this already, but let's just have to do a summary of the basis of gas exchange. So the first one is volume pressure relationships. This relationship we said earlier on is an inverse relationship, 1/x. That means when the thoracic volume increases, oxygen enters. When the thoracic pressure increases, carbon dioxide exits. So what that actually means is that when the thoracic volume increases, the pressure of oxygen in the thoracic cavity decreases, so oxygen moves into the thoracic cavity. Now, when the thoracic volume increases, the pressure of carbon dioxide decreases, rather increases. The pressure, so when the pressure of, so let's go back again. Now, when the thoracic volume increases, oxygen enters. When the thoracic pressure increases, carbon dioxide exits. The second basis for gas exchange is the partial pressure gradient. Partial pressure gradient. Gases move down a concentration gradient. In other words, gases, they move from a region of high partial pressure to a region of low partial pressure. So whenever we inhale oxygen, it means that the partial pressure of oxygen inside us is lower than the partial pressure of oxygen outside us, so oxygen moves in. When we exhale carbon dioxide, it means that the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in us is greater than the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in our environment, so carbon dioxide moves out. The third basis for respiration is a chemical base or a chemical criterion. The normal pH for human blood, the average is 7.4. Now, when the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in our blood increases, then our blood becomes acidic. That condition is called acidosis. When the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in our blood increases, our blood becomes acidic, and that condition is called acidosis. Acidosis can kill cells. So how does an increase in carbon dioxide in our blood lead to acidosis? When carbon dioxide accumulates in the blood, it reacts with water in the blood to form carbonic acid. This carbonic acid will shift the pH of blood, which is slightly alkaline, to acidic. So to avoid our blood from becoming acidic, we always exhale carbon dioxide. So how do we calculate partial pressures? Now, every gas in the atmosphere has a percentage composition. If you check your notes, we'll have that there. Every gas in the atmosphere has a percentage composition. So all gases in the atmosphere, they add up to 100%. Now, we have what we call the atmospheric pressure. The atmospheric pressure is a combination of the pressures of all the gases in the atmosphere. So in other words, every gas in the atmosphere has a partial pressure. When we combine all of these partial pressures, then we form the atmospheric pressure. Atmospheric pressure is highest at sea level. At sea level, the atmospheric pressure is 760 millimeters mercury. So the unit for measuring atmospheric pressure is millimeters mercury. So the highest atmospheric pressure we can get at sea level is 760 millimeters mercury. And this 760 millimeters mercury, it is a combination of all of the partial pressures of the gases in the atmosphere that when we combine them, it gives us 760 millimeters mercury. So how can you go about calculating the partial pressure of a gas? We'll take as our example oxygen and carbon dioxide, because these are the gases that are important in human respiration. Now, based on the notes that are given to you, you will realize that the composition of oxygen in the atmosphere, the percentage composition of oxygen in the atmosphere is 21%. So oxygen makes 21% of all of the gases in the atmosphere. So how do we calculate the partial pressure of oxygen? 21 over 100 times 760. So 21 over 100 times 760. That will give you 159.6 millimeters mercury. This is the highest partial pressure that you can get for oxygen, and this can only be attained at sea level. So if an environment has a partial pressure of oxygen at 159.6 or a value around that, then that environment is healthy. That will be a healthy environment. Now, if the partial pressure of oxygen is significantly lower than 159.6 millimeters mercury, then that environment is going to be an unhealthy environment. So maybe a very crude way of determining whether an environment, whether it has whether the oxygen levels are healthy or not will be if you reduce this 159.6 millimeters mercury by, I would say, 10 points. So if you have anything in the neighborhood of, say, 149.6 millimeters mercury and below, that's certainly going to be an unhealthy environment. Now, how about for carbon dioxide? So at sea level, at sea level, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide will be calculated as 0.04 over 100 times 760. Again, check your study material. To calculate the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in a healthy environment or at sea level, it will be 0.04 over 100 times 760. That will give us 0.304 millimeters mercury. If you have the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in an environment at 0.304 or about that, then that will be considered to be a healthy environment. Now, if the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is significantly higher than that value, then that environment will be considered to be an unhealthy environment. So higher in this case, if the partial pressure of carbon dioxide goes up to, say, 0.404 and above, that environment could safely be considered to be an unhealthy environment. Now, we'll be talking about gaseous exchange. Oxygen comes in, carbon dioxide goes out. Now, for these gases to be able to move in and out, they pass through a respiratory membrane. Gaseous exchange takes place across a respiratory membrane. There are 4 factors that constitute a good respiratory membrane, or that we may call requirements for a good respiratory membrane. So gases diffuse across a respiratory membrane. So what will be some of the features or characteristics of a good respiratory membrane? Number 1, it needs to be thin. Number 2, it needs to be moist. Number 3, it needs to be selective. And number 4, it needs to present a large surface area. When we say it needs to be selective, what does that mean? It has to be a surface area that allows oxygen to enter and allows carbon dioxide to move out. So it allows oxygen entry and CO2 exit only. The alveolar sac. We have said that the alveolar sac is the actual site for gaseous exchange in the lungs. The actual site for gaseous exchange in the lungs. So how are the alveolar sacs adapted for their function? Number 1, they are made up of a simple epithelium covering. Simple epithelium covering. Number 2, they are surrounded or coated with a surfactant. Surfactant. The surfactant is a slimy chemical that moistens the surface of these sacs. When a surface area, when a surface area or a surface is moist, it allows for easy gas exchange. Number 3, the alveolar sacs, they are made up of elastic fibers, so they can increase and decrease their volume. Next, macrophages. The alveolar sacs, they are armed with macrophages. Sometimes the air that comes in may be coming in with pathogens. So the macrophages are there to be able to fight these pathogens. Then the alveolar sacs, they have pores. Pores, these pores, their entry points, they also help with the respiratory process. Now, respiration is a two-phase process. Respiration is a two-phase process. We have the external respiration and internal respiration. External and internal respiration. External respiration. What happens during external respiration? Oxygen from the alveolar sacs in the lungs diffuses through the respiratory membrane surface into the blood, and then carbon dioxide in the blood will diffuse into the lungs. So for external respiration, across the respiratory membrane surface, oxygen from the lungs will diffuse into the blood, and carbon dioxide in the blood will diffuse into the lungs. Internal respiration. Oxygen in the blood will diffuse through a respiratory membrane surface to the tissues and the cells that requires this oxygen, while the carbon dioxide that is produced by the tissues and the cells will diffuse from the tissues to the blood. So respiration is a two-phase process: external respiration and internal respiration. External respiration is CO2 moved from the lungs to the blood. Carbon dioxide moved from the blood to the lungs. Internal respiration is when oxygen moves from the blood to the tissues or to the cells, and carbon dioxide moves from the tissues and the cells to the blood. Cellular respiration. When we say cellular respiration, we are referring to respiration that actually occurs in the cells. Now, the whole essence for cellular respiration is energy production. Glucose contains ATP molecules. ATP is adenosine triphosphate. Adenosine triphosphate. In other words, it is an adenosine molecule to which is attached three phosphate groups, adenosine triphosphate. Now, when we eat carbohydrate foods, it's broken down to glucose. Inside this glucose, we have ATP molecules. These ATP molecules, they are required to make energy that cells use, that cells need to carry out their chemical processes. Now, we need to break down this glucose to be able to release the ATP molecules that it contains. Now, to completely break down a glucose molecule, it is a three-stage process or a three-step process. Number one, glycolysis. Glycolysis takes place in the cytoplasm of the cell. It does not require oxygen, but it can use oxygen, but it does not require oxygen. And two ATP molecules are formed. In other words, during glycolysis, a glucose molecule, a small part of the glucose molecule is broken down, and two of the ATP molecules that it contains will be released. Step number two is called the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle. This takes place in the mitochondrion of the cell. If you remember, the mitochondrion sometimes is called the powerhouse. So the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle takes place in the mitochondrion. The mitochondrion has two chambers. So this takes place in the matrix, the matrix of the mitochondrion. Oxygen is required for this process and two ATP molecules are formed. So in other words, in the mitochondrion of the cell, a glucose molecule will be broken down and two more ATP molecules that this glucose molecule has will be released. Then we'll go to step number 3 or stage number 3. This is called the electron transport chain, ETC, electron transport chain. It takes place in the mitochondrion, but specifically in the cristae. The other chamber of the mitochondrion is called the cristae. So it takes place in the cristae of the mitochondrion, and it breaks down, this step breaks down the remainder of the glucose molecule. Remember step 1 broke down a small part of the glucose molecule. Step 2 broke down a small part of the glucose molecule, and then step 3 breaks down the rest of the glucose molecule. When it does that, it releases 32 ATP molecules. So, when a glucose molecule is completely broken down, a total of 36 ATP molecules are formed. A total of 36 ATP molecules are formed. We had 2 for glycolysis, we had 2 for the Krebs cycle, and we'll have 32 for the ETC. All right, now the ATP molecules have been liberated from the glucose molecule, but the cells can still not get the energy because the energy that the cells actually need is contained within the ATP molecule. So the ATP molecule in turn needs to be broken down so that that energy can be released and that energy will be used by the cells. Now, if you check the notes that are provided to you, you are able to see a balanced chemical equation there of cellular respiration. You may want to note that equation. You have to be in a position where you can write a balanced chemical equation that summarizes cellular respiration. Then let's move on to say something about the ATP-ADP cycle. ATP means adenosine triphosphate. And as we said earlier on, it is an adenosine molecule to which is attached 3 phosphate groups. There are, if you look at these 3 phosphate groups that are attached to the adenosine molecule, the first phosphate group, there's a chemical bond between the first phosphate group and the adenosine molecule. There's a second chemical bond between the first phosphate group and the second phosphate group, and there's a third chemical bond between the second phosphate group and the third phosphate group. So we have 3 chemical bonds: chemical bond number 1, chemical bond number 2, and chemical bond number 3. Energy resides. We have energy inside these chemical bonds. If we break any of these chemical bonds, energy will be released, and this is the energy. This is the energy that the cells need to carry out their cellular functions. However, in our cells, only chemical bond number 3 is broken down. Only chemical bond number 3 is broken down, the CB3. And chemical bond number 3 is broken down using water. Water is used to break down chemical bond number 3. So this will be called a hydrolysis process. Hydrolysis process. When chemical bond number 3 is broken down, the terminal phosphate group will be removed. The energy that is released from that broken chemical bond, that energy will be used for cellular work. Now, if one of the phosphate group is removed, then what is left of the original ATP molecule will be ADP, adenosine diphosphate. Di here means, which is Di, means two phosphate groups. This ADP is very reactive with inorganic phosphate. The ADP is very reactive with inorganic phosphate. So once as the ADP is formed, it will react with the first inorganic phosphate that it comes in contact with. So if you take the ADP and then you react it with an inorganic phosphate group, they will end up reforming an ATP molecule. So ADP plus phosphate will give us ATP. This ATP, again, the terminal phosphate group of this ATP will be removed, will be broken down by water, and then the energy that we had in this chemical bond will be released and it will be used by cells. Then the ATP molecule once more will become an AGP molecule, and this AGP molecule will react with a phosphate group to become an ATP molecule. This ATP molecule, the terminal phosphate group of this ATP molecule will be broken. That terminal phosphate group will be released, so that chemical bond will be broken. The terminal phosphate group will be released, and the energy that was contained in that broken bond will be used by the cell. So if you've been following what I've been saying, this is a circle. So we go from ATP to AGP, and then we'll go back to ATP. So this is what happens in the cell all the time. This is called the ATP ADP circle. This is essential because anytime the last phosphate group of ATP is removed by water, energy is released. The cells, they use that energy. Then this ATP molecule now becomes AGP, which will react with another phosphate group. It becomes ATP, and the circle continues. So this is what we call the ATP AGP circle. Now, the removal of a phosphate group will be called dephosphorylation. And the addition of a phosphate group will be called phosphorylation. So from ATP to ADP, that will be called dephosphorylation because it involves the removal of a phosphate group. This removal of a phosphate group is necessary because when the phosphate group is removed, energy is released that cells use. Now, to move from ADP to ATP, we'll call that phosphorylation because we are adding a phosphate group onto the AGP molecule. Transport of respiratory gases. So in respiration, the two main gases are oxygen and carbon dioxide. How is oxygen transported? Oxygen is transported carried on the surface of the red blood cells by the hemoglobin. So the red blood cells have a pigment called hemoglobin. This hemoglobin, oxygen attaches to this hemoglobin, and as the red blood cells are transported all over the body, they end up transporting the oxygen. So 98 0.5% of oxygen in our body is transported by red blood cells, and the oxygen is attached to the hemoglobin. 1.5% of oxygen is transported, dissolved in plasma. So you can see that oxygen does not dissolve very well in water. That's why only 1.5% of oxygen is transported, dissolved in plasma. So most oxygen, the bulk of oxygen is transported, carried by the red blood cells. Carbon dioxide. There are 3 ways of transporting carbon dioxide in our bodies. 7 to 10% dissolved in plasma. 20% carried by red blood cells attached to the hemoglobin, carried by red blood cells, and 70% transported as bicarbonate ions. So for carbon dioxide, we have bicarbonate ions 70%, hemoglobin in the RBC 20%, and then dissolved in plasma 7 to 10%. Transport pigments. They boost the rates of gas exchange, and they increase the capacity of fluids to transport gases. There are 2 main types of transport pigments in the human body. We have hemoglobin that is found in the RBC. When oxygen is transported attached to hemoglobin, it is called oxyhemoglobin. So for oxygen to be transported attached to hemoglobin, the oxygen and the hemoglobin, they'll combine to form oxyhemoglobin, which is abbreviated as HbO2. So the oxygen that is transported on the surface of the RBC, it is transported as oxyhemoglobin. The same goes for carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide combines with hemoglobin to form carbaminohemoglobin, HbCO2, carbaminohemoglobin. So that is how carbon dioxide is transported by the red blood cells attached to hemoglobin. The second pigment that we have in our body is myoglobin. Myoglobin has a greater oxygen binding capacity. So we'll find myoglobin in skeletal muscles and in heart muscles. When we say, remember, your heart has to be beating all the time. And when you go out there and you are running or doing some exercise, your muscles, they require more energy. And to make more energy, more oxygen is required. So you need to have a pigment that can supply the oxygen all the time because it has a greater oxygen binding capacity. So the reason why our heart can beat without getting tired, or our skeletal muscles can contract without getting tired most of the time, is so they're able to resist getting tired, is because they have this pigment, myoglobin, that supplies them with enough oxygen to make all of the energy that they actually need for continuous contraction. All right, we will probably end here. Aspects of homeostatic imbalances of the respiratory system. You have that in your notes. You can read that and ask me any question that you want to ask me. But essentially, we have 4 that are provided for you there. We have the chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases. The examples are the obstructive emphysema, and then we have the chronic bronchitis. That's for the chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases. The second one you have in your notes there will be asthma. The third one is tuberculosis, and number 4 will be lung cancer.